And wonderful. Here we are at the end of December for Friday office hour. Andrew, Jane, and Don are here from various workshops. My black eye is quickly recovering. And we're going to talk about narrative distance today. Andrew put up a piece for our second Wednesday workshop that was close narrative distance, third person, limited to the point of view of a character who was a terrible father at his daughter's wedding, totally inappropriate, and drunk. And so there were a couple places in the story, I can actually pull it up, but there were a couple places in the story where readers noticed that the point of view strategy changed. We left the main point of view character's visual focus to see some other visuals, including that of someone looking at his face. And so we were talking about how this is a narrative distance question as well as a point of view consistency issue. Does that seem like a good place to start, Andrew, or do you have thoughts?
No, I think that'd be great.
Okay, good.
I think my issue is that I don't even recognize that I'm doing it. It seems like a very subtle distinction, you're talking to a guy that thought there was like three different perspectives, first, second, and third person. So these subtle differences in close third or stuff like that kind of elude me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a fair amount of time going over this in class with you, Don, this semester, where you were talking about, the existence of an omniscient third person and whether that's a thing or not. And so, yeah, to pick up on what you're saying, Andrew, there are three. There's first person, second person, and third person. For the purpose of our conversation, we won't talk about second person at this point. It doesn't give us a lot of mileage. But even in first person, you have various differences in narrative distance. And by narrative distance, I mean how close the reader is to the events of the story, how close the reader is to the world of the story. So in a story like The Gutting of Couffignal by Dashiell Hammett, there's a first-person narrative. It's the Continental Op. And we find out at the end of the story that he knew all along who had committed the crime, but we're in his head. He's narrating his experiences as he goes through. But it turns out there was this whole understanding of the situation that he had that he never let us know about. And at the end, it comes out through dialogue that he knew it was this woman all along, and he sort of condemns her by telling her what he knew, and the whole situation comes out that way at the end of the story. But it felt like a close narrative distance. First person always feels like a very close narrative distance. It's someone telling you their story. But, some people play it close to the vest more than others, and some people won't let you in. You have first person narratives with characters by Raymond Carver who just don't have the emotional language to describe what's going on with them, or they might not be in touch with themselves. So if you look at certain third-person stories, it's possible that you can have a narrative distance that's even closer than in some first-person cases. But basically, when we're talking about narrative distance, it's a question of whether we're far out and sort of watching a character as if from above, or we're in a close narrative distance and we're seeing that world through the character's eyes. We're actually in that person's head, seeing out through their eyes, and on some level privy to their thoughts and how they're feeling. So does that make sense? As a quick primer on narrative distance. I think the bigger question, though, in your piece is that your narrative distance was consistent. Like, we're always in this guy Kenneth's head when we're doing that point of view, but there are places that shifted out of it. For example,
and they were mainly dealing with just the descriptions or dealing with the appearance of things or actions.
Yeah, so visually, we're starting here in the first paragraph in Kenneth's point of view. Kenneth continued to stare at his green shoes as he cocked an eyebrow and donned an exaggerated Bostonian accent. So, you know, we know his shoes are green. We know from above that they're stained green from one too many lawn mowing sessions. Kenneth is going to be the only character that knows how his shoes got turned green. So right off the bat, the reader is going to know, okay, I'm in Kenneth's head. I'm aware of the fact that he's nervous as he's speaking in front of this crowd. And it's as though we're up there on the podium with him looking out into the crowd. So a little bit further down, when we get this, Kenneth's eyes twinkled and the soft lighting glinted off his scalp through his thinning comb-over. It's not a narrative distance situation so much as it's a change in the point of view. So for the most part, when we talk about third person, we're talking about a third person limited point of view, limited to a specific character, often the main character of the story. And so once we go into Kenneth's head, we're not aware of what other characters are thinking or seeing. So if we're in Kenneth's point of view and he's looking out at the crowd from the podium at the front of the hall, it's a shift for us to get that soft lighting glinted off his scalp through his thinning comb over. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Absolutely, it does. I struggle with how I'm supposed to. To me, then it feels like there's a vacuum as to what the main character of the story is, yet we can see everyone else in it. You know, I'm going to write a story where you know where character A, B, and C, and D, and you know how all of them look and behave, but then you've got this main person. And I may be overthinking it, Seth. I tend to do that a lot.
We've got Don here, who's the king of the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So,
welcome.
You're not. I think these are good questions. I wouldn't worry about overthinking it. These are good questions. Don, do you want to chime in a little?
Yeah. I have a question along these lines as well. When I understand you're seeing it through a third person, you know, one particular character's point of view, you're seeing what he sees, you're hearing what he hears, you're in his head. But how far do you take that? In other words, let's say character A is there and they're in a group or something, and character B picks up a drink. Do we have to say character A saw character B pick up his drink? Or is it just that they are together in a room or they're sitting at a table, and so we can just say character B picked up his drink? Not that we have to go so much and say, yes, character A saw character B pick up his drink and take some.
So in the example from Andrew's story, once we've got it established that we're in Kenneth's point of view, we know how his shoes got green, we know that we're in his point of view, you don't need those.
Got it.
And you might have a line here and there that says, like, I watched him walk across the parking lot. And that's useful because maybe it's significant for that main character to report that he's literally watching someone do something.
Okay.
But it's like, if we're having a conversation and you just pick up the thing, I might notice it, but it might not mean that much to me. So you could just say he picked up his tea and drank.
Right. Okay.
But I think Andrew is getting at a bigger question. And I think, you know, as I understand it, your question is, if we have a main character who we're in the head of, are we creating a black hole by not showing the reader this person's face?
Or body, for that matter. I mean, I guess if you're going through their eyes, you could at least see their hands and maybe their legs at times.
Yeah, right.
But
I think this is what. So I think this is a good thing. I think that I think this is part of what helps a reader to sympathize and connect with a main character. And it's kind of a trade-off. It's like, I don't get to see your character's face, but I'm willing to give that up because I'm getting to understand how he feels and what's going on in his head. So it's a trade-off. And when you decide to give your reader that interior access, that privilege, then you lose some of the visuals of the face. But ultimately, once we accept the idea of the reader and the writer co-creating in Conroy's reader-writer energy zone spectrum graph, we're used to living the world this way. We're used to going around in the world not seeing our own faces. And so when we encounter that in a character, it doesn't feel odd to us to experience things through that lens. We're used to not seeing our own face. We're used to sometimes wondering, like, oh, do I have a tomato on my face? Am I getting crumbs in my beard? I don't know. And so, some of the anxiety over this kind of thing is human and helps us connect to the character. I would also say we don't necessarily need all the details of someone's face. One of the things that I said is that by seeing Kenneth do things in the story, we don't need to see what his face is like. Like, it's not necessarily significant that he has a comb over or he's bald or not. I'm seeing him do things like when his son comes up to pull him off the stage, I see that happen. You've created the stage and the characters on the stage in the story. And so because I can see them, they're inhabiting a space and co-creating with me, and I'm starting to care about them. And I actually think that's a kind of seeing them that's more important than something like he had a brown mustache, his hair was turning gray, his face was shiny because of the dim lights over him, or his eyes were glistening.
How are your thoughts about details like that for secondary characters?
Well, I think that the main focus here, from the writer's point of view, needs to be about the character. So the character who we're immersing ourselves in, who we're immersing our reader in, if that character is paying a lot of attention to how someone looks, then it's worth reporting that. But if there's a second or tertiary character who that primary character doesn't care about at all, then it's not necessary to report all the stuff about how that person looks. So it's like if you've got a father at a wedding, of course he's looking at his daughter and how she looks in her dress. And he's probably, really proud and loving how beautiful she looks. And he's going to scrutinize how the groom looks. And maybe he's going to look at his son's haircut and see if it's a good haircut or not. But he's not going to be looking at all the groomsmen and the bridesmaids with the kind of focus that he's going to be putting on his daughter. And so when you take the camera lens of the story and use it that way, then that's where you're doing double and triple duty to have the way the details are reported tell us stuff about the character.
Yeah, like, so what is it he notices in particular of his daughter or the groom, right? Rather than here's the full description of what she's wearing. Like maybe I haven't seen the story, but like, so, maybe of the groom, he notices that his jacket isn't done upright or something like that, right? It's distinct from the jacket is black or that kind of thing. And I think on the other earlier question, one of the things that sometimes that I do is if it's important, and I find that it's less important in a shorter piece, you can have dialogue with other characters that will give you some clues about how the person looks, the narrator looks, right? You can find ways to build it in without it having to come through the narrator's voice or eyes, right? It can come from other people if it's important that it be shown to the reader, how the person's face looks or something like that.
Like cast an icy expression or something along those lines. Although
No, not along those lines.
Don't use icy expression.
More along the lines of the son coming up and saying, "Hey, Dad, all three of your hairs are out of place," or something like that.
Yeah.
Or, "Hey, Dad, your chrome dome is looking kind of shiny. Can I wipe it off with this napkin?"
Or some
like
kid
that.
comes up and says, "Why are your shoes so green?"
Yeah. And the green shoes I like because he's looking at it and he feels awkward because he's at a wedding with tennis shoes that he's been mowing the lawn in. A, it's a bonehead move. And B, it's like he's actually feeling bad about it. So that tells me something about him. But yeah, I think what Jane's saying is that other characters could say through dialogue, hey, get those crumbs out of your beard. And then we know what he looks like in a way that other people can be a reflection of how we look more than we can see our own faces. And this is, I think the thing that you're missing a little bit is that we're used to operating this way in our lives. So when we see a character who's the main character of a story operating this way, it feels natural to readers. And they're used to, another thing is that readers are kind of used to putting themselves in that main position. So it's like, I might imagine myself on that podium, and Kenneth is going to have characteristics like mine until I find out otherwise. So if I don't find out what he looks like, I'm just sort of making my own version of Kenneth, and that's fine. It can be problematic if I find out 6 pages into the story that he's bald and the guy that I've been thinking about isn't bald, if it means something significant.
See, and that's what I worry about, is how you determine what details are critical about the character's appearance.
Well, I think it goes back to what Jane was saying, is that it's really all about what the character would notice. And the way that you use details can tell us so much about how he feels about things that he's seeing. So, for example, when he sees the groom, he says something about how his suit looks too shiny, and it tells us that he has some disapproval of the groom. The way that he describes that suit, you can do it in such a way that we get the visual of what the suit looks like, but we get so much more about how the narrator feels about that character. He could look at his suit and think, wow, that suit looks really expensive. I wonder where he bought it, or I wonder how he got all the money for that. Or it could be, that's a really practical suit, really smart, super stylish. Like, he could be impressed with the suit. He could be wondering where the guy got the money. He could think that the guy is dressed nicely. I mean, any of these are a spectrum that you can utilize to give us the description of the suit and the visual, and give us his feelings toward that character.
And I don't know what the story is, but also maybe he remembers what he was wearing when he got married. Maybe it wasn't a suit. Maybe, maybe he didn't have the money. I don't know. But but it all depends on what you're trying to do with the story.
I know that sense, but then it seems like it's a conflict with putting in too much internal monologue and too much internal thoughts. You know what I mean?
What makes you say that?
Well, because I think that's something I ran into in the past, Seth, and you've pointed it out, that a lot of writers at the beginning, they tend to do a ton of exposition and a ton of internal thinking. And so I really try to shy away from that and use it in very sparse details. And I don't know how that would, if I'm going to start including someone's reactions to everything that they see that makes it specific to them, then suddenly I feel like I'm in their head and doing all this.
Yeah, I mean, unlike Jane, I wouldn't encourage you to go down the road of the memory of what he wore to his wedding, because that is going to take us out of the present storyline. But the point is, you're not going into interior monologue if you're doing something in the service of giving us a visual description. So if you're telling us that he wore a gray suit with a navy blue vest under it, the vest had 6 buttons and a nice matching tie, and the suit looked like it was tailored to fit him perfectly, I'm getting that, and I'm visualizing what the suit looked like, but I also have some sense about how the character feels, about how that speaker feels about the person in that suit, right?
The fact that he's paying attention to those things.
Yeah, but also it's like, the character isn't saying, he's wearing a sloppy suit with like long lapels and a ketchup stain on the elbow.
What if you say you had a character, John, and it's from his point of view, and something like, John always thought of himself as a very strong man. One time he actually crushed a mouse in his hand to death, that I'm thinking of of Mice and Men. Is that out of his point of view, or is that still in his point of view?
I think that's in his point of view, but the thing that you have to think about there is the change in temporal distance. So if I'm telling you a story about these characters at a wedding, and then all of a sudden I throw in a description about something that John did years ago,
right?
I'm pulling you out of the current storyline, so I'm going to lose narrative momentum on that.
Well, say it was a different story. I'm thinking of
Well,
mice
let me
and
just
men.
say one more thing. You could
Yeah.
just put that in through dialogue. Like, oh, did you know that John crushed a mouse in his hand once? Yeah, he's really strong.
But would that violate the point of view, though? If not in, in another story.
No, no.
Okay.
I think the larger issue here that we're getting at with the questions that Andrew's asking, and Jane, let me know how you think about this. Once you've accepted a narrative strategy, say third person point of view, close enough that we're inside the character's head, and we're going with Kenneth's viewpoint on the whole situation, you get a certain amount of benefits with that. You get privileges of these are things that I can see, but you also have to understand the limitations of that point of view. Just the same as if we're doing a first person narrative, you can't switch in the middle and say what, if the guy goes off stage, you can't just switch in the middle and give us what's happening while he's off stage from someone else's point of view. Like in the Great Gatsby, it's all first person through Nick's point of view. We only know what's going on with Jay Gatsby when Nick is there. And so, that's a limitation of that particular first person point of view. It works the same in third person. When you're limiting us to a certain character's perspective, you just have to recognize, you can't give us visual that character is not privy to. You can't go inside other people's heads. If someone is doing something out of the room from where that character is, you can't report that. And so it's just a matter of realizing like what you can and can't do based on the decision that you've made. And when you're not aware of those things, it takes you into transitions that you don't know you're making. And those are really hot spots for where readers can get kicked out.
Yeah, that was a real adjustment for me at the beginning too. It took me a while to see that, but there are real benefits for being inside the head, but it can be frustrating in that you then start to see, like I went through a phase where I was like, I started to see everything that I couldn't talk about. But then you sort of go to a next stage where it's like, okay, you have to make a decision about what you do want to talk about that's, and then find a different way to bring it in, still through the point of view of the main character. And actually that, I think, has more power ultimately in terms of the storytelling, because it makes it a richer, I'm not explaining it very well, but it makes it a richer experience, not just visually, but in terms of the emotion, if you like, of the story. When it's all coming through that channel, it has a lot more power, but it's just harder to figure out how to make sure everything is in that channel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in The Great Gatsby,
I think
when
so.
he was using Nick Carraway as that independent narrator, gave Fitzgerald a lot of latitude, because you have Nick telling the reader what Jay Gatsby told him about his
Right.
childhood. So you have so much, you can bring in the other characters' inner thoughts because that's what he told me. So I think that's why you use that technique. It's so much.
But you can always have characters telling each other what they're feeling. Yeah, I think what Jane is saying is the piece at the end of that is that you really increase you really increase the reader's connection to the character.
Yeah.
We saw that in Jeannie's piece in this workshop, Andrew, when we saw the revision the second time. Everything she had done just made us that much closer to the character. And so it stripped out all this extra stuff, but it made the emotion of the piece resonate so much more. And it did so much more for Jeannie as a writer of that piece. Did you follow that part of the discussion?
Mm-hmm.
And you remember the older version, she had all these thoughts that were in there and retrospective ideas about what it was like to be that kid from an adult narrator. And so just by focusing the whole narrative into that child's point of view, it really created the world in a way that had so much more resonance and emotion for readers.
I see the benefits of all of it. I do. I don't think I have to be sold on that. It still seems kind of nebulous to me, the difference, the small difference even the examples you sent me, Seth, where I'm reading Henry Warburton had never much cared for snowstorms, and then the next one is Henry hated snowstorms. To me, that kind of feels like just two slightly different characters. I don't know that I would be able to see those as separate narrative distances. One guy just doesn't much care for him, and another guy freaking hates him.
Well, hang on a sec. I can pull that up. Well, I think part of what it is about is how much information the reader is getting about the character and how well we know that character's experience. Just to go back to one thing I was thinking about before, if we're dealing with sort of a Dickens kind of world, it's as though there's this writer narrator that's way above all the characters, and we can switch and get the thoughts of lots of different characters. But the trade-off for being able to switch around like that is that we never really get too deep into any of the characters' heads. So we might see Madame Defarge knitting and know that she's thinking about this guy going to prison, but we're not going to get like a really close point of view version of, what it's like to see the world through her eyes while she's knitting. And maybe she's nervous that her money's going to get taken away, or maybe she's wondering, how many stitches she did, and she might be losing her memory and can't remember how many lines this is supposed to have. So, one of the tools that we do in class that you missed because we started you with that shortened class is that we'll take a bunch of stories that we read and then compare the narrative distances. So with Jane's class, we did Hamlet and Patricia Highsmith. With Dawn's class this semester, we did
Hemingway.
Yeah, Hemingway was really far out narrative distance.
Yep.
I think that would be cool to be able to, because I just have a much better.
Well, one of the things that we do is look at a handful of different stories and then sort of put them on a spectrum of narrative distance. If we look at the handout, which comes from it's sort of a spin-off of a piece on psychic distance from John Gardner's Art of Fiction. So the furthest out narrative distance, and you might, take some more time to look at this and figure it out over the weekend. But, so this far out narrative distance, we only know him as a large man. And so we don't even know his name or what it's like to be him. Then in the second one, we get to know his name, but the emotional understanding is kind of tepid. So it's not so much how the emotions are reported, but it's like, if I know a guy as Henry J. Warburton, it's not as intimate as knowing him as Henry. So I'm getting more intimate with his existence.
That part, that makes a little bit more sense.
And then God, how he hated these damn snowstorms. We're really getting the language that represents how he thinks, We're starting to get a sense of his voice and how he sees the world. And then finally, snow under his collar, down inside his shoes, freezing and plugging up his miserable soul. It's like we know what it feels like inside of his shoes. We know stuff about his soul and under his collar. It's very different. You look at the beginning of Lolita, and he's conjuring a way that he moves his tongue inside his mouth, and then you try it, and you move your tongue the same way. It's like you've got this immediate, super close connection to this guy, Humbert. It really gives us a close narrative distance right away and sort of intoxicates us to a guy who we wind up finding out does terrible things. But there are pluses and minuses to both ends of the spectrum. You can look at a story like The Hills Like White Elephants, Ernest Hemingway, and he's basically operating at a 5. We find out what's going on with the characters, but it's all through the dialogue. And the visuals are completely, they're objective. They're not from anyone's point of view or anyone's subjective focus.
I sometimes think of it like a telescope or like a zoom lens, right? So, how you can like get wide and back as distinct from right in very narrow focus but very close up. So, and then, narrative distance 5 is the way back, more all encompassing panorama or landscape view, if you like. And then you get as you get more into that level one where you're not just in their head, but you're right in their head. Snow down my collar, like you're feeling it, or the tongue in the throat. You're like the really in that narrow part of the vision, and then that's what you're seeing everything else through when you're down at number one. But I know this is a crazy way to think of it, but anyway, but when you're up at 5, right, in the landscape view, you're sort of much more you're not following somebody's vision in that way with a lens, right? The lens has got everybody in it.
But if you take Hills Like White Elephants, if it were a movie, that camera would be on those two people. That would be very close. Yep, the distance that we are told that it's an objective point of view, so it's very far. But so that's kind of confusing.
Well, it's close in the sense that you're only looking at two people, but it's far in the sense that what you're looking at is two people who you don't, if I remember correctly, you don't really even know their names till later, right? It's a woman and a man, and so it's distance in that sense.
And you're kind of seeing the bar and the train station waiting area. You see the waitress come in and out. So, you know, I think that the visual movie camera comparison works up into a point. And the point that it changes is that in fiction, you can actually go inside someone's head. So it's like in a movie camera, we might start out and see a whole panorama of people. We zoom in. We finally realize like this guy walking through the crowd is the main character. Then we zoom in and we see his face. Then we might see what it looks like over his shoulder and we're getting his viewpoint. But in fiction, we can even go into his head and know how he feels and know what he's thinking about. And so, you know, you have all of these tools and options as a writer, but as they say in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so therefore you have to realize what the repercussions of the decision that you're making are. And so you're going to gain some things and give up some things. Often what happens with writers on any level is that we sort of intuit our way into a narrative distance or a narrative strategy for a story. We just go with something that feels right and mostly stick to it unless something really weird changes later on. But it's just a matter of once you make that decision or work your way into it, you stay consistent with it. If you make switches out of it, you do them at a really visible point, like a scene break or a section break or a chapter break. And you recognize, you know, what you can't do as a result of that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah. I think, you know, I was talking about my book, Young Junius, with some of the students recently. Nell was reading it, and you know, that's one where it's all close narrative distance, third person from a lot of different characters, but each time the point of view changes, it's at a major section break or a chapter break. And so within those sections, we only have an awareness of one character's thoughts and one character's vision outside of their eyeballs. And then through the amalgamation of them all, you can create a whole world with huge amounts of depth in a kind of cubist mode a bit. But within each one, as a writer, you have to recognize, or I had to recognize, what are the limitations here? This character has no compassion, so he's not going to notice those people who are panhandling over there. This character is only trying to rob a bank, so he's only looking at where the guard is. You know, any number of things like that. But also, you know, once I'm in this guy's point of view, I can't look at him from the outside and know what his face looks like. That feels like a good stopping point to me. I think these are all really good questions. It's the holidays, so we'll stick closer to a half an hour. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think you're right on track, Andrew, and you're in a process of figuring this out that that we've all gone through. I'm definitely happy to recommend some short stories for you, and then we can talk about what the spectrum is of the narrative distance with them.
Yeah, I do that.
We'll get that done. Yeah. And Yeah, that's basically narrative distance and point of view.
Cool. Thanks, Jane.